There are things that happened in the Middle Ages that science has never fully explained. Not for lack of trying, not for lack of interest, but because the evidence runs out at a certain point. The documents contradict each other. The physical traces have disappeared, and what remains is a gap in the historical record that looks, the longer you stare at it, less like an absence of information and more like a question that the past is deliberately refusing to answer. If you are lying down right now, if the lights are low and the world outside has gone quiet, then you have chosen exactly the right moment for what we are about to explore together. Because the mysteries we are going to move through tonight are not the comfortable kind. They are not puzzles with solutions waiting to be found at the back of the book. They are the other kind, the kind that stay with you, the kind that make you look at the history you thought you knew and realize that the parts you were never told about are, in many ways, the most interesting parts of all. 100 events, 100 moments from the medieval world that have been examined by historians, analyzed by scientists, debated by archaeologists and physicians and linguists and astronomers, and that have emerged from all of that scrutiny still unexplained, still open, still asking their questions into the silence of the centuries that separate them from the moment you are listening to this. So settle in. Let your breathing slow. Let the day you have just lived begin to soften at its edges, and let us go back together into the part of the past that the textbooks left out. The medieval period is, in many ways, the worst possible era for mysteries. And by that, I mean it is the best possible era for mysteries that cannot be solved. Earlier periods left us physical evidence, bones and tools, and the traces of structures that archaeology can work with, even in the complete absence of written records. Later periods left us documentation so extensive that the gaps in knowledge are relatively small and relatively easy to identify. The medieval period left us something in between, enough written records to know that things happened, not enough to know precisely what they were or why. Enough physical remains to raise questions, not enough to answer them. The monks who wrote the chronicles that are our primary sources for much of medieval history were not journalists. They were not scientists. They were men of faith recording what they saw through the lens of a worldview that made no fundamental distinction between the natural and the supernatural, between an event that had a physical cause and one that had a divine one. When a medieval chronicler wrote that the sky turned red for 3 days, he was not offering a hypothesis about atmospheric conditions. He was recording a sign. What the sign meant mattered more to him than what caused it. And so, the causes, in document after document, across 1,000 years of European history, went unrecorded. The questions were never asked. Only the wonder was preserved. It is in that wonder, preserved in the ink of 1,000 years of monastic record-keeping, that tonight's journey begins. In the summer of 1518, in the city of Strasbourg, a woman named Frau Trophäa walked out into the street and began to dance. There was no music, there was no celebration, there was no apparent reason. She simply danced, and she did not stop. After several days, her feet were bleeding. After a week, she had been joined by dozens of others, men and women who had also begun dancing without being able to explain why or to stop themselves from continuing. Within a month, the number of dancers had grown to somewhere between 400 and several hundred, depending on which contemporary account you consult. And people were dying. Not from injury alone, though the injuries were severe, but from exhaustion, from heart failure, from the sustained physical catastrophe of a body that could not rest. The city authorities, following the medical advice of the time, initially responded by hiring musicians to accompany the dancers, on the theory that the dancing would run its course more quickly if it was allowed to continue freely. This decision almost certainly made things worse. The dancing plague of 1518, as it has come to be known, lasted approximately 2 months before it ended as mysteriously as it had begun. Modern researchers have proposed several explanations. Mass psychogenic illness, a condition in which psychological distress manifests as physical symptoms across a group, is the most widely accepted. Ergot poisoning, caused by a fungus that grows on grain and produces compounds chemically related to LSD, has been suggested. Stress-induced trance states in a population that had been subjected to years of famine, disease, and social upheaval have been proposed as a contributing context. None of these explanations is fully satisfying. None of them explains why it happened in Strasbourg in 1518 and not in other times and places where the same conditions of stress and famine and ergot-contaminated grain existed. The dancing plague remains, after 5 centuries of examination, genuinely unexplained. Sometime around the year 1150, 2 children emerged from a pit or a cave near the village of Woolpit in Suffolk, England, according to accounts recorded by 2 independent chroniclers writing within living memory of the event. The children, a boy and a girl, were notable for 2 things above all others. They spoke a language that no one in the village could identify or understand, and their skin was green, not the green of illness or of bruising. According to the accounts, a consistent and apparently natural green coloring of the skin that faded over time as the children adapted to eating ordinary food. The boy died relatively quickly after their emergence. The girl survived, learned English, was baptized, and reportedly lived for many years, though the accounts disagree about what became of her. When she was eventually able to communicate, she described coming from a land she called St. Martin's Land, a place where the light was always dim, like the light after sunset, and where everything was green. She could not explain how she and her brother had come to be in the pit where they were found. She could not describe the journey. She simply said that they had been following their flock of cattle and had heard a loud noise and then found themselves in the pit in Woolpit. Modern explanations have ranged from the medical hyperchromic anemia, a condition that can cause greenish skin discoloration, to the sociological, the children may have been Flemish immigrants whose language was unfamiliar and whose diet had been severely deficient, to the frankly speculative. The green children of Woolpit have been cited in discussions of everything from underground civilizations to parallel dimensions. What they actually were, where they actually came from, and what their skin color actually indicated remain questions that the historical record, rich enough to preserve the story but not rich enough to explain it, has never been able to answer. The Voynich manuscript is a book. It is approximately 240 pages long. It is written in an alphabet that has never been identified as matching any known writing system. It is illustrated with detailed drawings of plants that do not correspond to any identified species, astronomical diagrams whose meaning remains contested, and human figures engaged in activities that scholars have been arguing about for more than a century. It was purchased in 1912 by a rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich, who found it in a collection of manuscripts at a Jesuit college in Italy, and it has been the subject of sustained and intensive scholarly attention ever since. Carbon dating has placed its creation in the early 15th century, making it a product of the late medieval period. The vellum it is written on, the pigments used in its illustrations, and the physical construction of the book are all consistent with European manufacture of that period. Beyond these physical facts, almost nothing is agreed upon. The text has been analyzed by professional cryptographers, including teams that worked on breaking military codes during the Second World War. It has been subjected to computational analysis using every statistical tool available to modern linguistics. It has been examined by experts in medieval Latin, Arabic, Hebrew, and dozens of other languages. No one has decoded it. Some researchers argue that the statistical properties of the text are consistent with a natural language, that the patterns of letter and word frequency resemble those found in real writing systems. Others have argued that it is an elaborate hoax, a book designed to look meaningful while containing nothing. The hoax theory has significant problems, chief among them the question of why anyone in the early 15th century would invest the extraordinary time and skill required to produce 240 pages of internally consistent, meaningless text. The Voynich manuscript sits in the Beinecker Rare Book and Manuscript Library at Yale University, available for anyone to examine, photographed and digitized, and more accessible than at any point in its 600-year history. And it has never been more thoroughly studied or more thoroughly unexplained. The year 1284 in the town of Hamelin in Lower Saxony is recorded in a window of the town's market church, one of the oldest documentary references to what has become one of the most enduring stories in European folklore. The window, which no longer survives, but which was described by multiple later sources, depicted a piper and a group of children, and bore an inscription recording that on the day of Saints John and Paul, 130 children born in Hamelin were led away by a piper and lost at the Calvary near the Koppen. This is not a fairy tale recorded centuries after the supposed event. It is a near-contemporary civic record preserved in a church window commemorating something that the town of Hamelin apparently believed had actually happened to its children in 1284. Later versions of the story added the detail of the rats, the mayor's broken promise, the revenge of the piper, the elements of moral fable that have come to define the popular version. But the earliest sources contain none of this. They record simply that 130 children disappeared. Historians have proposed numerous explanations. A children's crusade that left Hamelin in 1284 and was never heard from again. A plague that killed the children and was later mythologized. A mass migration of young people to newly colonized territories in Eastern Europe. A historical process that was genuinely occurring in this period and that involved recruiters traveling through German towns. A landslide or flood that killed a group of children playing near the Koppen Hill. None of these explanations fully accounts for all the elements of the earliest accounts. The children of Hamelin disappeared in 1284. 740 years later, no one knows where they went. The Antikythera mechanism is not, strictly speaking, a medieval mystery. It was created in the ancient world, probably in the 1st or 2nd century BC, and was recovered from a shipwreck off the Greek island of Antikythera in 1901. But its relevance to the medieval period is profound and genuinely puzzling. The mechanism is a geared astronomical calculator of extraordinary sophistication, capable of predicting eclipses, tracking the positions of the sun and moon, and modeling the cycles of the planets with an accuracy that modern analysis has found remarkable. The technology it represents, precise interlocking gears of the kind used in mechanical clocks, was not supposed to exist in the ancient world. And here is where the medieval mystery enters. The mechanical clock, which depends on the same fundamental principles of interlocking gears and regulated motion, was developed in medieval Europe in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and medieval clockmakers describe their work as a new invention. If the technology of the Antikythera mechanism had been known in the ancient world, it was completely lost for more than 1,000 years, only to be independently reinvented in the medieval period by craftsmen who had no knowledge of what their ancient predecessors had achieved. The question of how that knowledge was lost, whether it was lost gradually or suddenly, whether it survived in fragments that influenced medieval thinking in ways too indirect to trace, and whether other ancient technologies underwent the same cycle of invention, loss and reinvention, is one that the history of medieval science has never fully answered. The summer of the year 536 is described in sources from Europe, the Middle East, and Asia as a period of prolonged and catastrophic darkness. A mysterious fog or cloud obscured the sun for 18 months, reducing temperatures across the northern hemisphere to their lowest point in the past 2,000 years. Crops failed across Europe, the Middle East, and parts of Asia. Famine followed. The Byzantine historian Procopius wrote that the sun gave forth its light without brightness, like the moon, during this whole year, and it seemed exceedingly like the sun in eclipse. Modern researchers have identified a massive volcanic eruption, likely in Iceland, as the probable cause of the initial event, followed by further eruptions in 540 and 547 that extended and deepened what has been called the Late Antique Little Ice Age. But the full scope of the event, the precise chain of causation that connected the atmospheric disruption to the famines and plagues that followed, and the question of how much this climate catastrophe contributed to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire and the political fragmentation that defined the beginning of the medieval period, remains an area of active and sometimes contentious research. The year 536 may be the most catastrophic year in human history. It stands at the threshold of the medieval world, and it casts a shadow over everything that followed it. The city of Roanoke, the lost colony of the late 16th century, falls at the very edge of the medieval period and is better known as an early modern mystery, but it connects to a pattern of disappearances and abandonments that runs throughout medieval history with a frequency that historians have never been able to fully explain. Entire villages in medieval Europe were abandoned, sometimes gradually and sometimes apparently suddenly, leaving behind structures that show no sign of violent destruction, no mass graves, no evidence of fire or plague or military attack. The phenomenon is common enough in the English archaeological record that abandoned medieval villages have their own acronym, AMVs, and their number runs into the thousands across Britain alone. In most cases, the abandonment can be attributed to known historical factors: the Black Death, agricultural collapse, the enclosure of common land by large landowners, the simple economic unviability of a settlement in a changed landscape. But in a significant number of cases, the evidence is insufficient to support any specific explanation. The village was there, then it was not. The people who lived in it went somewhere. Where they went and why they left when they did, and not earlier or later, are questions that the ground, excavated and analyzed and dated with every tool available to modern archaeology, has sometimes been unable to answer. The monk and scholar Roger Bacon, writing in the 13th century, described in his works a series of inventions and technologies that would not become reality for centuries after his death. He described flying machines. He described self-propelling boats and carriages. He described devices for seeing at great distances and for lifting enormous weights with minimal effort. He described spectacles for correcting vision at a time when the technology to grind lenses to the required precision was in its earliest infancy. Some of these descriptions can be read as theoretical speculation, the imaginings of a brilliant mind freed from practical constraint. Others are specific enough to suggest that Bacon had encountered in some form knowledge or devices that his contemporaries did not possess, and that the historical record does not account for. Where this knowledge came from, whether from Arabic scholarly sources that Bacon had access to through his extensive learning, from earlier European traditions that have not survived, or from something else entirely, is a question that the history of medieval science finds genuinely difficult to answer. Bacon was imprisoned by his own Franciscan order for reasons that the records describe only vaguely as suspected novelties, a charge that suggests his superiors were disturbed by the nature of his ideas, without the documents explaining precisely what it was about those ideas that disturbed them. The phenomenon known as St. Elmo's fire, the electrical plasma discharge that appears as a glowing light around pointed objects during thunderstorms, was observed and recorded throughout the medieval period, and was interpreted consistently as a supernatural manifestation, a sign from God or the saints, a portent of coming events. What makes the medieval records of this phenomenon interesting is not the misidentification, which is entirely understandable given the absence of any framework for understanding atmospheric electricity, but the consistency and specificity of the descriptions. Medieval sailors who reported St. Elmo's fire on their masts described it in terms that match modern accounts with remarkable precision: the color, the sound, the conditions under which it appeared and disappeared. The accuracy of the observation, combined with the complete inaccuracy of the explanation, is itself a kind of historical mystery about the relationship between what medieval people saw and what they were able to understand about what they were seeing. The gap between those two things, the gap between accurate perception and adequate explanation, runs through the entire medieval encounter with the unexplained, and it is one of the reasons why the events of this period remain so difficult to interpret from a modern perspective. The Shroud of Turin is a length of linen cloth bearing the faint image of a man who appears to have been crucified, and it is one of the most studied and most contested objects in the history of medieval artifact examination. It was first publicly displayed in the 14th century in the French town of Lirey, where its owner claimed it was the burial shroud of Jesus Christ. It has been the subject of scientific testing, most notably a radiocarbon dating study conducted in 1988 that dated the cloth to the medieval period, specifically between 1260 and 1390. This result was widely interpreted as settling the question of the shroud's authenticity. It was a medieval forgery, and the case was closed. Except that the case was not closed, because the question of how the image was produced has never been satisfactorily answered. The image on the shroud is not a painting. Analysis has found no pigment applied to the cloth in the areas where the image appears. The image is a surface phenomenon, affecting only the outermost fibers of the linen, and it is a photographic negative, meaning that the true appearance of the image only becomes apparent when it is viewed as a negative, a property that would have been meaningless and undetectable to a medieval forger who had no concept of photography. How a medieval artisan, working in the 13th or 14th century, created an image with properties that were not understood or even detectable until the invention of photography in the 19th century is a question that the radiocarbon dating, whatever it tells us about the age of the cloth, does not answer. The reports of rains of fish, frogs, and other animals falling from the sky appear in medieval chronicles with a frequency and a geographical distribution that makes them difficult to dismiss as simple fabrications. The phenomenon is real and has a physical explanation. Waterspouts and tornadoes can lift aquatic animals from bodies of water and carry them considerable distances before depositing them elsewhere, sometimes in quantities large enough to cover a field or a street. What the medieval accounts cannot tell us, because the observers lacked the conceptual framework to connect the rain of fish with the waterspout that produced it, is where the animals came from or how they arrived. What they recorded was the arrival, detailed and specific and apparently genuine in its bewilderment, stripped of the cause that modern meteorology can supply, but that no medieval chronicler ever witnessed or described. These accounts are a perfect illustration of the medieval mystery as a category, events that were real, that had physical causes, but whose causes were invisible to the people who experienced them, leaving behind records that are accurate about the what and entirely silent about the why. There is a particular kind of medieval mystery that belongs not to the human world, but to the natural one. Events recorded in the sky, in the earth, in the water, in the bodies of animals and the behavior of weather that arrived without warning and departed without explanation, leaving behind only the ink of a monk's careful hand and the question of what exactly he had witnessed. These events are in some ways the hardest category of medieval mystery to evaluate, because the tools available to modern science for investigating them are powerful but not unlimited. We can read ice cores and tree rings and sediment layers and reconstruct with considerable precision what the climate was doing in a given year of the medieval period. We can analyze the chemical composition of atmospheric deposits and identify volcanic eruptions that occurred 1,000 years before any instrument was in place to record them. But there are events in the medieval natural record that even these sophisticated tools cannot fully account for, events whose physical traces are ambiguous or absent, whose documentary records are detailed enough to be tantalizing and incomplete enough to be frustrating, and that sit at the edge of what modern science can confidently explain, and stare back at the researchers examining them with what feels, after enough time spent with the documents, almost like patience. The year 1258 produced what modern climate scientists now believe was the largest volcanic eruption of the past 7,000 years. The evidence for this eruption exists in ice cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, which preserve layers of volcanic sulfate deposited by the eruption's atmospheric effects with extraordinary clarity. The eruption was almost certainly the largest single injection of sulfur dioxide into the stratosphere in recorded history, producing a volcanic winter that significantly reduced temperatures across the northern hemisphere for several years afterward. The medieval chronicles of the period record exactly the kind of consequences you would expect from such an event: failed harvests, famine, unusual cold in summer, reports of strange weather and atmospheric phenomena. There is one significant problem. No one knows where the volcano was. The ice core evidence establishes that the eruption happened with certainty. The distribution of the sulfate deposits in the ice suggests it was in the tropics, but no tropical volcano has been convincingly identified as the source of an eruption of this magnitude occurring in this year. The largest volcanic event of the past 7 millennia happened in 1258, was felt across the entire planet, shaped the climate of the medieval world for years afterward, and the mountain that produced it has never been found. The Winchester Chronicle and several other English sources record that, in the year 1222, the sea around the coast of England withdrew dramatically from the shore, exposing the seabed for a considerable distance, before returning in a wave that caused significant damage to coastal settlements. The event matches the description of a tsunami, and researchers have proposed a seismic event in the North Sea or the English Channel as the probable cause. However, no corresponding geological evidence of a significant earthquake in this region at this date has been identified. The written record is detailed and appears in multiple independent sources, which argues against simple invention or exaggeration. The physical record is silent. The event either occurred without leaving geological traces sufficient for modern detection, or it occurred as the result of a cause that has not yet been identified, or the multiple independent chronicle accounts are all describing something that did not happen in the way they describe it. None of these options is fully satisfying, and the 1222 coastal event remains on the list of medieval natural phenomena that the documentary and physical records between them cannot resolve. Ball lightning, the rare atmospheric phenomenon in which luminous spheres of various sizes and colors appear during or after thunderstorms, move in ways that conventional lightning does not, and disappear without warning, was observed and recorded throughout the medieval period with a consistency that predates any scientific understanding of the phenomenon by centuries. Medieval accounts describe glowing balls of light entering buildings through closed windows, moving slowly through rooms, and disappearing with a sound like an explosion or simply vanishing silently. They describe these lights appearing during storms, following people along roads, hovering over bodies of water. Modern physics has never produced a fully satisfactory theoretical explanation of ball lightning. It has been observed in the modern period, photographed and reported by credible witnesses, including trained scientists, but it has never been produced or captured under controlled laboratory conditions. The medieval accounts of it are, in their descriptive content, remarkably consistent with modern reports. What they are not consistent with is any explanation. Medieval observers attributed it to demonic activity, to divine warning, to the malevolent action of witches. Modern physics attributes it to plasma physics, or to microwave radiation, or to several other competing hypotheses, none of which has achieved consensus. The medieval chroniclers and the modern physicists are, in this respect, equally uncertain about what they are describing, separated by 8 centuries and by the difference between theological and scientific frameworks for expressing uncertainty, but united by the fact that the thing itself has never been explained. The Chronicle of Gervase of Canterbury, written in the late 12th century, contains one of the most discussed astronomical observations in medieval history. On the evening of June 18th, 1178, Gervasis records that 5 monks at Canterbury reported observing the upper horn of the crescent moon split apart, and from the division a flaming torch sprang up, spewing out fire, hot coals, and sparks over a considerable distance. The upper portion of the moon throbbed and pulsated. This cycle repeated itself a dozen times or more, and then the whole moon took on a blackish appearance. In 1976, the geologist Jack Hartung proposed that what the Canterbury monks had witnessed was the impact of a meteor on the lunar surface, the event that created the relatively young crater Giordano Bruno on the far side of the moon. The hypothesis attracted significant attention and some scientific support. It also attracted significant criticism. Computer simulations suggested that an impact large enough to produce the visual effect described by Gervase would have generated a meteor shower visible from Earth over the following weeks, and no such shower is recorded in any contemporary source. The debate about what the Canterbury monks saw on the evening of June 18th, 1178, has never been resolved. The observation is too specific and too consistent with certain physical possibilities to be easily dismissed. It is too problematic in its implications to be simply accepted. It sits in the literature of medieval astronomy as one of the most carefully examined and most stubbornly ambiguous records that the period has left us. The Red Rain of Kerala, which occurred in 2001, and involved red-coloured rainfall across a region of southern India for approximately 2 months, produced a scientific controversy that has not been fully resolved and that connects, in interesting ways, to medieval accounts of coloured precipitation. Throughout the medieval period, European chronicles record instances of red rain, yellow rain, and rain that appeared to contain blood, falling over specific regions and interpreted by contemporary observers as divine signs or portents. Modern analysis of the Kerala red rain found that the colour was produced by spores of a type of algae that had been carried into the atmosphere, probably by a meteorological event, and subsequently deposited by rainfall. Medieval coloured rains almost certainly had similar mundane explanations. Dust from distant deserts, pollen carried by unusual winds, algal or fungal spores distributed by atmospheric events. But the medieval records are specific enough, and the modern scientific literature on atmospheric transport of biological material is complex enough that not every medieval coloured rain event has a fully documented physical explanation. The phenomenon sits in an interesting borderland, well understood in its general mechanism, incompletely explained in its specific historical instances. The Tunguska event of 1908, in which an asteroid or comet fragment exploded in the atmosphere above Siberia with a force equivalent to a large nuclear weapon, flattening approximately 2,000 square kilometers of forest without leaving a crater, demonstrated that impacts of extraordinary destructive power can occur without the physical traces that earlier researchers assumed would be detectable. This has led some researchers to re-examine medieval chronicle accounts of sudden catastrophic events, unexplained fires, mass deaths of animals, strange atmospheric phenomena, and towns described as having been destroyed by what the chronicles call fire from heaven, with new attention to the possibility that some of these events may have been the result of atmospheric impact events, whose traces were either too subtle for later geological detection or have simply not yet been looked for in the right places. The 12th century chronicles of several European regions contain accounts of sudden fires consuming entire areas of forest or field without apparent human cause. The 13th century records of certain Central Asian regions describe catastrophic events that some researchers have proposed, cautiously, might be consistent with impact events. None of these proposals has been confirmed, but the Tunguska precedent has permanently altered the scientific framework within which medieval catastrophe accounts are evaluated. The medieval warm period, which lasted roughly from the 10th to the 13th centuries, produced climatic conditions across Europe and the North Atlantic that were significantly warmer than those of the preceding centuries, and that enabled agricultural expansion, population growth, and the settlement of regions like Greenland and parts of North America that became uninhabitable when the climate cooled again in the 14th century. The Norse settlement of Greenland, established around 985 by Eric the Red and his followers, flourished for approximately 400 years under the relatively mild conditions of the medieval warm period, and then collapsed, its population disappearing entirely sometime in the 15th century as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip on the North Atlantic. The physical evidence of the Norse Greenland settlements is extensive. Their farms, their churches, their middens, their animal bones, all preserved by the cold in remarkable detail. What the physical evidence does not clearly show is precisely why and how quickly the population disappeared. Did they die in place? Did they emigrate? Did they integrate into the indigenous Inuit population that was expanding southward as the Norse settlements were contracting? The documentary record, which consists primarily of records from Norway and Iceland written by people who were not present in Greenland, is ambiguous and in some cases contradictory. The fate of the Greenland Norse, one of the best documented colonial populations of the medieval period, remains genuinely uncertain. The Black Death, which reached Europe in 1347 and killed somewhere between a third and a half of the continent's population over the following years, is the most catastrophic demographic event in European history, and its cause, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas carried by rats, has been confirmed by modern genetic analysis of medieval mass graves with what appears to be definitive clarity. And yet, even this most studied of medieval catastrophes retains mysteries that the identification of its causative agent has not resolved. The speed with which the plague moved through some regions, and the curious fact that certain areas appear to have been almost entirely spared while neighboring regions were devastated, has never been fully explained by rat and flea transmission dynamics alone. Some researchers have proposed that pneumonic plague, transmitted directly between humans through respiratory droplets, was responsible for the fastest-moving episodes of the epidemic. Others have suggested that the genetic variability of the medieval European population in terms of immune response may have created the uneven geographical pattern of mortality in ways that are difficult to model. And there is the question of the plague's sudden retreat, the way the worst of the epidemic simply stopped, not because of any medical intervention, which did not exist, and not because the rat and flea populations had been eliminated, but for reasons that epidemiologists and historians are still debating 7 centuries after the last mass graves were filled. The phenomenon of spontaneous human combustion, in which a human body is found extensively burned while the immediate surroundings show little or no fire damage, appears in medieval records with a frequency and a consistency of description that has attracted the attention of researchers across several disciplines. The modern scientific consensus attributes cases of what appears to be spontaneous human combustion to the wick effect, in which clothing or body fat acts as a slow-burning fuel source in the presence of an external ignition source, typically a candle or an open fire, burning for hours at very low intensity and consuming the body with remarkable completeness while causing relatively little damage to the surrounding area. This explanation accounts for most modern cases and is probably applicable to many medieval ones. But the medieval records include cases in which no external ignition source is mentioned or apparent, and in which witnesses describe the combustion beginning without any prior contact with fire. Whether these accounts reflect accurate observation of genuinely anomalous events, inaccurate observation of events that had mundane explanations, or the tendency of medieval chroniclers to shape their records according to narrative expectations, is a question that the documents alone cannot answer. The strange death of King John of Bohemia at the Battle of Crécy in 1346 is one of the medieval period's most thoroughly documented and most persistently puzzling historical events. John was blind, had been blind for approximately a decade before the battle, and yet, according to multiple contemporary accounts, he insisted on participating in the fighting personally, ordering his knights to tie their horses to his so that he could be led into the thick of the combat. He was found dead after the battle, still tied to his knights, all of them fallen together. The story itself, a blind king charging into battle by choice, is strange enough. What makes it historically mysterious is what happened afterward. The Black Prince of Wales, Edward, is said to have taken John's device, the 3 ostrich feathers, and the motto "Each Dien, I serve," as his own in honor of the fallen king's valor, and this device has been carried by the Prince of Wales ever since. The historical record of this adoption is impeccable. The reason for it, the precise circumstances of the encounter between the Black Prince and the dead Bohemian king on the field at Crécy, is described differently in different sources, and the full story of what happened in the hours after the battle and what the Black Prince saw or was told that moved him to this act of heraldic appropriation is a gap in the record that 7 centuries of historical research has not been able to fill with certainty. The oracle of Cumae, the Cumaean Sibyl, the prophetic tradition of the ancient world, fed into the medieval period through the Sibylline books and through a prophetic literature that was extraordinarily influential in shaping medieval political and religious thought. The prophecies attributed to the Sibyl and to the tradition of prophetic writing that developed from her supposed utterances predicted events in medieval history with a specificity that contemporaries found astonishing and that modern historians find genuinely difficult to account for through the normal mechanisms of historical coincidence. The prophecy literature was, of course, extensively edited and updated over time, fitted to events that had already occurred in a process that scholars call vaticinium ex eventu, prophecy after the fact. But the degree to which this editorial process accounts for all of the apparent predictive content of the Sibylline tradition, and the question of what the earliest, least edited layers of the tradition actually said, and when they were actually composed, is a problem in medieval textual scholarship that has occupied specialists for generations without producing consensus. The disappearance of the Templar treasure at the arrest of the Knights Templar in 1307 is one of the medieval period's most enduring and most commercially exploited mysteries, embedded now so deeply in popular culture that it is difficult to approach the historical question without first clearing away the accumulated weight of fiction and speculation that surrounds it. The Knights Templar were an extraordinarily wealthy military and financial organization at the time of their arrest by Philip IV of France, and the records of what was confiscated when the arrests were made suggest that the wealth actually recovered was considerably less than what the organization's known assets should have produced. The Templar fleet, based at the port of La Rochelle, disappeared before the arrests could encompass it. Where it went and what it carried has never been established. The documentary record of the Templar finances in the years immediately before the arrests is incomplete in ways that some historians attribute to deliberate concealment and others to the ordinary documentary losses of the period. What the Templars did with their wealth in the weeks between the news of Philip's intentions becoming known and the night of October 13th, 1307, when the arrests were carried out simultaneously across France, is a question that the surviving records are precise enough to make interesting and incomplete enough to leave permanently open. The medieval period produced numerous accounts of encounters with creatures that do not correspond to any known animal species, described with a specificity and a geographical grounding that distinguishes them from purely mythological accounts on one hand and from obvious misidentifications of known animals on the other. The sea serpent reports of Norse and Scottish medieval chronicles, the accounts of large unknown creatures in alpine lakes, the descriptions of animals in African and Asian sources that reached European scholars through translation and that do not match any identified species, all of these sit in a complicated relationship with what modern zoology knows about the distribution and extinction of large animals in the medieval period. The thylacine, the Tasmanian tiger, survived until 1936. The coelacanth, believed extinct for 65 million years, was found alive in 1938. The okapi was unknown to Western science until 1901. The medieval natural world contained genuine large animals that European scholars did not know about and could not have known about. The question of which medieval creature accounts represent misidentified known animals, which represent encounters with animals that are now extinct, and which represent something else entirely, is one that paleozoology and medieval studies approach from very different directions and have not yet managed to resolve together. There is a certain kind of silence that ancient stone produces, not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of a room that has never been filled, but the silence of a place that was once full of something, full of knowledge and intention and human effort on a scale that is difficult to comprehend, even when you are standing directly in front of the evidence of it. The great medieval buildings of Europe produce this silence in abundance. The cathedrals that rise above their cities like geological formations, the castles whose walls are thick enough to contain entire rooms within them, the bridges and aqueducts and fortifications that have outlasted by centuries the civilizations that built them, all of these structures ask a question that their builders did not leave behind a sufficient answer to. How? How did people working with the tools and the materials and the organizational capacity of the medieval period produce things that challenge the engineering assumptions of the modern world? How did they lift stones that weigh hundreds of tons to heights that modern cranes would approach with caution? How did they achieve acoustic properties in their buildings that concert hall designers of the 21st century study and attempt to replicate without fully understanding? How did they orient their structures with an astronomical precision that required either instruments we have not found or knowledge we have not accounted for? The stones are still there. The knowledge that produced them is, in many cases, not. And in that gap between the surviving object and the lost understanding that created it, some of the most profound mysteries of the medieval world quietly wait. Chartres Cathedral, completed in its current form in the early 13th century after a fire destroyed most of its predecessor, is considered by architects and acousticians to be one of the most sophisticated acoustic environments ever constructed. The building's interior produces a reverberation time of approximately 5 to 6 seconds at low frequencies, a property that transforms music performed within it in ways that modern recordings cannot fully capture, and that modern acoustic engineers have studied extensively without being able to fully account for through the known principles of medieval construction. The placement of the building's stone surfaces, the curvature of its vaults, the distribution of its windows, the dimensions of its nave and transept, all interact to produce acoustic effects that appear to have been intentional, but for which no written record of intentional acoustic design survives. Medieval builders did not leave behind treatises on acoustics. They left behind buildings. And the buildings, examined with every tool that modern acoustic science can bring to bear on them, suggest a level of understanding of sound behavior in enclosed spaces that the documentary record of medieval knowledge does not account for. Whether this understanding was theoretical, based on principles that were known and applied but never written down, or empirical, built up through generations of trial and error in the construction of smaller buildings before being applied at the scale of the great cathedrals, or something that emerged from sources that have not been identified, is a question that the stones ask and the documents do not answer. The construction of Salisbury Cathedral presented its builders with a problem that modern structural engineers have analyzed with considerable unease. The cathedral's spire, added in the 14th century, and still the tallest medieval spire in England at 123 meters, sits on foundations that were not designed to bear its weight. The foundations of the original cathedral, built in the 13th century, rest on only about 1 meter of topsoil above a water meadow, a substrate so inadequate for a structure of this weight that modern engineering assessment suggests the building should not be standing. The spire has visibly deformed the 4 central pillars that support it, bending them inward under its weight in a way that is clearly visible to visitors standing in the crossing today. The cathedral has been continuously monitored and intermittently reinforced since the medieval period. It has survived for 7 centuries on foundations that modern engineering would not approve for a building of a fraction of its weight. How the medieval builders managed to construct something that has lasted this long on a foundation this inadequate, whether through an intuitive understanding of load distribution that has never been formally articulated, through continuous maintenance that has compensated for the inadequacy of the foundations across generations, or through a combination of factors that has not yet been fully analyzed, is a question that structural engineering and medieval architectural history between them have not resolved. The Longyu Caves of China fall outside the medieval European context that has defined most of our exploration tonight, but they belong to the broader category of medieval construction mysteries with full justification. Discovered in 1992, when a farmer pumped water out of what appeared to be a pond and revealed instead the entrance to an enormous artificial cave, the Longyu complex consists of at least 24 large chambers carved from solid siltstone, covering a total area of approximately 30,000 square meters, with ceilings up to 30 meters high. The walls of the caves are covered with a consistent pattern of parallel chisel marks, applied with a regularity that suggests either an extraordinary degree of craft discipline across a very large workforce, or the use of some guiding method or tool that has not been identified. The caves are believed to have been constructed during the Qin dynasty, around 2,000 years ago, though the dating is not fully established. What makes them a medieval mystery in the relevant sense is not their age, but their obscurity. Despite their enormous scale, no historical record of their construction, their purpose, or their existence has been found in Chinese historical sources. A project that required the removal of an estimated 1 million cubic meters of stone, employing a workforce of thousands over an extended period, left no documentary trace whatsoever. The silence of the historical record around the Longyu Caves is itself the mystery, as profound and as unexplained as anything the caves themselves contain. The medieval Islamic world produced scholars and scientists whose achievements are only now being fully appreciated by historians of science, and among those achievements are several that suggest knowledge of physical principles that the standard narrative of scientific history does not account for in the medieval period. The Baghdad Battery, a set of ceramic jars with iron rods and copper cylinders found in archaeological contexts near Baghdad and dated to the Parthian period around 2,000 years ago, has been proposed as evidence of ancient electrochemical technology, a primitive battery capable of generating a small electrical current. The proposal is contested, and the archaeological context is genuinely ambiguous. But in the context of medieval Islamic science, what is less contested is that scholars working in Baghdad and other centers of Islamic learning between the 8th and 13th centuries developed theoretical and practical knowledge of chemistry, optics, mathematics, and astronomy that was significantly in advance of contemporary European understanding, and that was transmitted to Europe through translation movements whose full scope and significance historians are still mapping. The question of what was lost in that transmission, what was present in the Arabic sources that the translators did not understand or chose not to render into Latin, and what the full extent of medieval Islamic scientific knowledge actually was, is one of the most important open questions in the history of science. The Gothic cathedral builders of 12th and 13th century France developed and applied structural solutions that modern structural engineers have spent considerable effort analyzing, and that continue to produce results that are not fully accounted for by any single theoretical framework. The flying buttress, the pointed arch, the ribbed vault, each of these innovations solved specific structural problems in ways that allowed the walls of Gothic buildings to be thinned, their windows enlarged, and their heights increased beyond anything previously attempted in European construction. The sophistication of these solutions is not in dispute. What is less clear is how the builders arrived at them. The mathematical tools available to medieval builders were not, by modern standards, adequate for the engineering calculations that their buildings implicitly required. They did not have calculus. They did not have the theory of structures in any formal sense. They did not have the ability to model load distribution through a complex three-dimensional structure in the way that modern computer-aided design allows. What they had was a tradition of practical knowledge transmitted through apprenticeship and embodied in the hands and eyes of craftsmen rather than in written texts, that produced results which formal mathematical analysis, applied retrospectively, struggles to fully explain. The Gothic cathedral is an object created by people who should not, by the available account of their theoretical knowledge, have been able to create it. The Piri Reis map, drawn by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis in 1513, and preserved in the Topkapi Palace Museum in Istanbul, depicts the coastlines of South America, Africa, and, according to some interpretations, Antarctica, with a geographical accuracy that has generated more controversy than almost any other medieval cartographic document. The South American and African coastlines are rendered with a precision that, for 1513, is remarkable but explicable. Piri Reis explicitly stated that he used earlier Portuguese maps as sources, and Portuguese exploration of these coasts had been extensive in the decades before his map was compiled. The controversy centers on the southernmost portion of the map, which some researchers have interpreted as depicting the coastline of Antarctica, including features of the continent's geography that were not discovered by European explorers until the 19th century, and that are today concealed beneath the Antarctic ice sheet. Other researchers argue, with considerable force, that this interpretation is a misreading of the map's projections and distortions, and that what appears to be an accurate depiction of Antarctica is actually a distorted representation of the southern tip of South America. The debate between these positions has generated a substantial literature and has not been resolved. What is agreed upon is that the Piri Reis map is a document of extraordinary cartographic sophistication for its period, compiled from sources that are not all identified, and that its southernmost section depicts something that has been interpreted in radically incompatible ways by serious researchers. The acoustic properties of Stonehenge, the prehistoric monument on Salisbury Plain in England, have been the subject of modern acoustic research that has produced findings relevant to the medieval period in an indirect but significant way. Stonehenge predates the medieval period by approximately 3,000 years, but it was a presence in the medieval landscape, was written about by medieval chroniclers, including Geoffrey of Monmouth, and was attributed by medieval writers to the agency of Merlin, who was said to have transported the stones from Ireland by magical means. The acoustic research findings, which suggest that the original complete monument would have produced significant sound diffraction and reverberation effects that are not present in its current ruined state, have raised questions about the relationship between prehistoric monument construction and acoustic intentionality that resonate across the history of sacred architecture into the medieval period. If prehistoric builders were attending to the acoustic properties of their monuments, and the evidence suggests they may have been, then the acoustic sophistication of medieval cathedrals is not an isolated medieval achievement, but part of a much longer tradition of human attention to the relationship between built space and sound, a tradition whose full extent and whose mechanisms of transmission across millennia are genuinely unknown. The medieval period produced several instances of maps and geographical documents that appear to contain information that should not have been available to their creators, given the known state of geographical exploration at the time of their composition. The Vinland map, allegedly a 15th century document depicting a landmass west of Greenland, identified as Vinland, and apparently representing North America, has been the subject of one of the most sustained and most contentious authenticity debates in the history of medieval cartography. Scientific testing of the map's ink has produced contradictory results across multiple studies, with some analyses suggesting the presence of compounds not available before the 20th century, and others finding nothing inconsistent with a medieval origin. The debate about the Vinland map is a perfect illustration of the broader problem of evaluating medieval documents that claim to contain knowledge beyond what the standard historical narrative allows. If the map is genuine, it requires a significant revision of what was known in 15th century Europe about the geography of the North Atlantic. If it is a forgery, it is a forgery of sufficient sophistication to have defeated repeated scientific testing over more than half a century. Either conclusion is remarkable. The problem of medieval alchemy occupies a peculiar position in the history of science. Dismissed for centuries as pseudoscience, superstition, and the confused groping of pre-scientific minds toward goals that were inherently impossible, it has been partially rehabilitated by historians of science who have demonstrated that alchemical practitioners made genuine empirical discoveries in chemistry, metallurgy, and pharmacology that were significant contributions to the development of those fields. What has not been rehabilitated is the central alchemical project, the transmutation of base metals into gold and the production of the philosopher's stone. These goals were impossible by the chemistry available to medieval practitioners, and they remain in their literal form outside the range of chemical possibility. And yet, the alchemical literature of the medieval period contains descriptions of procedures and observations that are specific enough to suggest genuine experimental work rather than pure theoretical speculation, and that have in some cases been found by modern chemists to describe real chemical phenomena, rendered in the symbolic and allegorical language that alchemical tradition required, but grounded in actual laboratory experience. The question of what medieval alchemists actually did, what they actually observed, and what genuine knowledge they encoded in their deliberately obscure writings is one that the history of chemistry has been working on for decades without arriving at anything like a complete answer. The medieval Islamic mathematician and polymath al-Biruni, working in the early 11th century, calculated the radius of the Earth to within 1% of the value accepted by modern science, using a method involving the measurement of the angle of depression of the horizon from a known height that required both mathematical sophistication and careful observation. He did this approximately 5 centuries before Galileo, and approximately 8 centuries before the development of the mathematical tools that modern physics considers necessary for precision measurement of this kind. The accuracy of al-Biruni's result has been confirmed by modern calculation. The method he used has been reconstructed from his written descriptions and found to be theoretically sound. What this tells us about the state of medieval Islamic scientific knowledge is significant. What it tells us about how much of that knowledge was transmitted, preserved, and built upon is more complicated. Al-Biruni's calculation was known to medieval European scholars who had access to Arabic sources in translation, but its influence on European scientific thought appears to have been limited. The question of why certain medieval scientific achievements were transmitted and developed while others were preserved but not built upon is one of the most important and least answered questions in the history of medieval science. The construction techniques used in the building of Mont Saint-Michel, the island abbey off the coast of Normandy, whose construction began in the 8th century and continued through the medieval period, present problems that architectural historians have examined in detail and that have not been fully resolved. The abbey sits on a granite outcrop that rises sharply from the surrounding tidal flats, and the medieval builders addressed the challenge of building on this irregular and sharply sloping site by constructing a series of interconnected crypts and supporting structures that effectively created an artificial platform on which the abbey church and its dependencies were built. The engineering of this supporting structure, which distributes the enormous weight of the buildings above it through a three-dimensional system of arches and vaults of varying sizes and orientations, has been analyzed by modern structural engineers who have found it to be more sophisticated in its load management than the documentary record of medieval engineering knowledge would lead one to expect. The builders of Mont Saint-Michel solved problems that the formal engineering theory of their period did not have the tools to solve, at least not in the way that modern engineers would solve them. How they did it, through what combination of empirical experience and intuitive understanding and accumulated craft knowledge, is a question that the building itself poses with extraordinary clarity, and that the historical record answers only partially. Imagine for a moment that you are an architect in the 21st century. You have access to computer modeling software of extraordinary sophistication. You have materials science, structural engineering theory, geotechnical analysis, centuries of accumulated formal knowledge about how buildings behave under load and over time. And you are asked to explain from first principles how a group of medieval builders, working without any of these tools, managed to construct a building that has stood for 800 years on foundations that your software tells you should have failed within decades. This is not a hypothetical situation. It is the actual position that modern structural engineers find themselves in when they analyze Salisbury Cathedral, or the flying buttresses of Notre Dame, or the crossing tower of Ely Cathedral, which was rebuilt in the 14th century after the original collapsed, and which has stood ever since in a configuration that modern analysis finds structurally marginal at best. The medieval builders did not have the theory. They had the result. And the result, standing in stone above the English and French countryside, is more durable than the theories developed to explain it. The medieval period produced several accounts of individuals demonstrating knowledge or abilities that the documentary context of their lives does not explain. Hildegard of Bingen, the 12th century German abbess, composer, theologian, and natural philosopher, produced works of medical and botanical knowledge that describe plants, their properties, and their applications with a specificity and an accuracy that has been confirmed by modern pharmacological analysis in a significant number of cases. She described the medicinal properties of compounds and preparations that would not be formally analyzed by Western science for centuries after her death. She attributed her knowledge to divine vision, describing detailed visual experiences that modern neurologists have proposed were the result of migraines, a condition whose visual symptoms she described with clinical precision while explaining them in theological terms. Whether Hildegard's medical knowledge came from direct observation and experiment, from sources she had access to through the extensive library of her monastery, from the oral medical traditions of her region, or from some combination of these, is a question that her biographers have examined without producing consensus. What is agreed upon is that the accuracy of significant portions of her medical writing exceeds what the known sources available to a 12th century German abbess should have produced. The disappearance of knowledge is, in many ways, as mysterious as its survival. The medieval period inherited from the ancient world a body of scientific, philosophical, and technical knowledge that was transmitted incompletely and unevenly, with some works surviving in multiple copies, while others were lost entirely after the fall of the institutions that had preserved them. The Library of Alexandria, whose destruction has been blamed at various times on Julius Caesar, the Christian Emperor Theophilus, and the Muslim Caliph Omar, was probably not destroyed in a single catastrophic event, but was rather diminished over centuries by the gradual deterioration of its institutional support, its collections dispersed and its scholars displaced, as the political and economic conditions that had sustained it changed beyond recovery. What was in that library? What knowledge it contained that has not survived in any other copy or any other form is a question that cannot be answered, because the evidence needed to answer it was lost with the library itself. The medieval world built its intellectual life on the surviving fragments of ancient knowledge and did not know, could not have known, what it was missing. We know more about what was lost than the medieval scholars did, because we have found enough fragments of enough lost works to understand the scale of the absence. But knowing the scale of the absence is not the same as filling it, and the gap between what the ancient world knew and what the medieval world inherited from it remains one of the most significant and most permanent mysteries in the history of human knowledge. There is a category of medieval mystery that belongs neither to the natural world nor to the built one, but to something harder to define and harder still to explain. It belongs to people, to the way groups of human beings, living in the same place at the same time, under the same pressures and within the same belief systems, sometimes did things together that no individual among them could have initiated alone, and that no external force appears to have compelled. Mass behavior in the medieval period produced some of the most genuinely puzzling events in the historical record, events that modern psychology and sociology and epidemiology have approached with their full range of conceptual tools, and that have emerged from that scrutiny still resistant to complete explanation. The medieval crowd was capable of things that the sum of its individual members does not account for. It moved in ways that reason does not fully predict. It followed leaders who appeared from nowhere and disappeared just as quickly. It abandoned cities, crossed continents, and walked into the sea. And the explanations that survive in the documents are explanations given by people who were as bewildered by what they had done as the historians who have been trying to understand it ever since. Tonight, we move into this territory, into the space where human behavior in the medieval period became something that the period itself could not explain, and that the centuries since have not fully explained either. The Children's Crusade of 1212 is one of the most debated events in medieval history, partly because the sources describing it are contradictory, and partly because what the sources agree on is so strange that historians have spent 2 centuries arguing about whether it happened at all in the form the chronicles describe. The broad outline, as reconstructed from the available sources, is this. In the summer of 1212, large groups of young people, described in some sources as children and in others as a mixture of youth and poor adults, gathered in France and Germany under the leadership of 2 figures, a French shepherd boy named Stephen of Cloyes and a German boy named Nicholas of Cologne, and set out toward the Mediterranean with the declared intention of reaching the Holy Land and recovering Jerusalem through the power of faith rather than of arms. The French contingent, which gathered at Vendôme and marched to Marseille, dispersed when the sea failed to part for them, as Stephen had reportedly promised it would. The German contingent, which crossed the Alps under Nicholas and descended into Italy, reached the coast near Genoa, with its numbers drastically reduced by the hardships of the journey, and similarly failed to find a way across the sea. What happened to the participants of both contingents after the movement's failure is described differently in different sources, with accounts ranging from dispersal and return home to sale into slavery by unscrupulous merchants. Modern historians have questioned whether the participants were primarily children in the modern sense, whether the movement was as large as the sources suggest, and whether the 2 contingents were actually connected or were independent phenomena that later chroniclers merged into a single narrative. What is not questioned is that something happened in the summer of 1212, that large groups of people moved across France and Germany in a coordinated way that no individual authority appears to have organized, and that the movement ended in failure and dispersal whose full human cost was never recorded. The town of Hamelin in Lower Saxony commemorated on June 26th of each year, in a ceremony whose origins reach back to the medieval period, an event that the town's own records describe as the greatest misfortune that has befallen Hamelin since its foundation. We touched on this event in our first section, but it deserves a deeper examination here in the context of medieval mass behavior, because what the earliest sources describe is not simply a disappearance, but a departure, a voluntary movement of a large group of children that the town's adult population was unable to prevent or explain. The earliest reference to the event, predating the addition of the Ratcatcher narrative by at least a century, is the church window inscription recording that 130 children born in Hamelin were led away by a piper and lost. The word led is significant. It implies willingness, or at least compliance. It implies that the children followed. Whether they followed a person, a sound, a promise, or something that the sources do not describe because the witnesses who survived could not describe it, the historical record does not say. What it says is that they went. 130 children on a specific day in June of 1284 left Hamelin and did not come back. The modern explanations proposed for this event, a children's crusade, a plague, a mass migration to Eastern European settlements, a dancing mania similar to the Strasbourg event of 1518, each account for some features of the record and fail to account for others. The piper at the center of the story, whatever he represents, whatever human reality or psychological force or historical event he was transformed into by the storytelling process that eventually produced the fairy tale, corresponds to something that actually happened in Hamelin in 1284. What that something was remains, 740 years later, unanswered. The The flagellant movement that swept through Europe in the aftermath of the Black Death beginning in 1348 was one of the most dramatic examples of mass religious behavior in the medieval period, and one whose psychological dynamics modern researchers have found both comprehensible and deeply strange. Groups of men, ranging in size from dozens to hundreds, moved through the towns and cities of Germany, the Low Countries, France, and elsewhere, performing public rituals of self-flagellation, beating themselves with leather straps studded with iron spikes in elaborate choreographed ceremonies conducted in public spaces while crowds gathered to watch. The movement attracted followers with remarkable speed, drawing people from all social classes and spreading across multiple countries in a matter of months. It also attracted fierce opposition from the Church, which condemned it and eventually suppressed it, partly because the flagellants were bypassing the institutional Church's role as mediator between humanity and God, and partly because some flagellant groups were developing theological positions that the Church found heretical. What modern psychology finds interesting about the flagellant movement is the speed and the scale of its spread, the way it crossed linguistic and political boundaries as if those boundaries did not exist, and the nature of the group experience it produced. Witnesses describe the ceremonies as producing altered states in participants and observers alike, states of emotional intensity that contemporary accounts struggle to find language for. Whether these states were the result of pain-induced endorphin release, of collective ritual behavior producing psychological effects well documented in other cultural contexts, or of something that the available psychological frameworks do not fully capture, is a question that the historical and psychological literature has examined without reaching consensus. The medieval phenomenon of mass pilgrimage produced movements of people across Europe on a scale that has few parallels in other periods, and it produced, within those movements, events and experiences that the pilgrims themselves described as miraculous, and that modern researchers have examined with tools ranging from medical history to social psychology, without arriving at explanations that fully account for all of what the sources describe. The pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain, one of the three great pilgrimage destinations of the medieval world, alongside Rome and Jerusalem, attracted hundreds of thousands of travelers across the medieval centuries, and the accounts of what happened to people on the road and at the shrine are among the richest and most detailed records of medieval religious experience available to historians. They describe healings of conditions whose medical descriptions are specific enough to be analyzed by modern clinicians, spontaneous remissions of symptoms that had been chronic and disabling, recoveries from injuries and illnesses that the medical knowledge of the period could not have produced through treatment. Some of these accounts can be attributed to misdiagnosis, to the natural resolution of conditions that would have resolved without pilgrimage, to the powerful psychosomatic effects of intense religious experience and belief. Others describe specific physical changes, the restoration of lost function, the healing of wounds that had been open for years, that the available medical and psychological explanations do not straightforwardly account for. The Liber Sancti Jacobi, the 12th century compilation of pilgrim accounts associated with Santiago de Compostela, contains hundreds of such narratives. Historians have been reading them for a century and are still arguing about what they describe. The phenomenon of stigmata, the spontaneous appearance of wounds corresponding to those of the crucifixion on the bodies of religious individuals, appears in the medieval historical record beginning with Francis of Assisi in the 13th century and continuing throughout the later medieval period with a frequency that has attracted the sustained attention of both theologians and physicians. The medical literature on stigmata is extensive and inconclusive. Cases have been documented in the modern period under controlled conditions that exclude fraud and that have produced no satisfactory physical explanation for the appearance of the wounds. The medieval cases are harder to evaluate because the documentary evidence is filtered through the hagiographical tradition, the literature of saints' lives, which had its own conventions and its own investment in miraculous narrative. But the frequency of the phenomenon in the medieval period, the consistency of its forms, and the independence of the accounts from different regions and different religious communities suggest that whatever stigmata are, they were a genuine feature of medieval religious experience rather than simply a narrative convention. What they are, in terms of physical mechanism, remains one of the questions that medicine has approached most carefully and answered least satisfactorily. The medieval reports of werewolves occupy a position in the historical record that is genuinely ambiguous in ways that the folklore tradition has obscured. There were people in the medieval period who were tried and convicted of being werewolves. There were confessions, obtained with the same methods we discussed in our earlier exploration of medieval torture, in which individuals described transforming into wolves and committing acts of violence in that transformed state. There were witnesses who testified to having seen transformations occur. The question that the historical record poses is not whether medieval people believed in werewolves, which is well established, but what the real events were that the werewolf narrative was applied to. Serial killers, individuals who committed multiple murders and who were described by contemporaries in terms of bestial behavior, have been identified by modern criminologists in several medieval werewolf cases. Individuals suffering from conditions such as clinical lycanthropy, a rare psychiatric disorder in which the patient genuinely believes themselves to transform into an animal, have been proposed as the basis for some accounts. Hypertrichosis, a rare genetic condition producing excessive hair growth, has been suggested as the physical basis for some werewolf identifications. The connection between wolf behavior and certain forms of rabies, which can produce aggression, nocturnal activity, and other behaviors that medieval observers might have interpreted as transformation, has also been proposed. None of these explanations accounts for all the cases in the medieval record. The werewolf, as a category of medieval experience, was almost certainly not a single phenomenon, but several different phenomena unified by a narrative framework that made them comprehensible to the people experiencing and recording them. The medieval vampire, like the werewolf, was not simply a folklore figure, but a category applied to real events in the medieval world, events that had genuine physical causes, which the vampire narrative made interpretable within the medieval conceptual framework. The most significant of these real events was the phenomenon of bodies that, when exhumed weeks or months after burial, appeared to show signs of continued life, bloated appearance, liquid blood, preserved flesh, ruddy coloring. We now understand these appearances as the normal products of certain decomposition processes, influenced by soil conditions, temperature, and the manner of death. Medieval observers did not have this understanding. What they saw when they exhumed a body in these conditions was a corpse that appeared not to have died. The logical conclusion within a medieval worldview that included the theological concept of the undead was that the person was continuing to exist in some form and to feed on the living. The vampire panic that followed such an exhumation, with its ritual of staking, decapitation, and burning, was a community's attempt to deal with what appeared to be a genuine supernatural threat. The threat was not what it appeared to be, but the social and psychological dynamics of the panic, the way it spread through a community, the way it identified victims and assigned agency to the dead, are genuine historical phenomena that modern social psychology finds genuinely interesting and genuinely complex. The medieval period produced several well-documented cases of what modern medicine would diagnose as epidemic encephalitis, a brain inflammation that produces a striking and unusual symptom profile, including profound lethargy, sleep disturbances, and a range of neurological and psychiatric effects. The sleeping sickness epidemic that swept through Europe in the early 20th century, known as encephalitis lethargica, produced symptoms that were described by medieval chroniclers in accounts scattered across the medieval centuries, suggesting that similar epidemics had occurred in the medieval period without being recognized as a distinct disease entity. Individuals described as sleeping for days or weeks at a time, awakening confused and behaviorally changed, were interpreted in medieval records as having experienced divine visions, demonic possession, or supernatural sleep. The same symptoms in different cultural contexts produced different explanatory narratives. The physical reality beneath the narratives, the neurological event that produced the sleep and the behavioral changes, was the same across the centuries. The recognition that medieval accounts of supernatural sleep and modern accounts of encephalitis lethargica may be describing the same underlying phenomenon is a relatively recent development in the history of medieval medicine, and its full implications for the interpretation of medieval accounts of unusual states of consciousness have not yet been fully explored. The medieval accounts of possession, in which individuals were described as having been taken over by demonic forces and exhibited behaviors that were not consistent with their normal personalities, have been examined by modern psychiatry with results that are more complex than the simple equation of possession with mental illness. That was the initial response of the medical profession when it first engaged systematically with the historical literature. Certain possession accounts, read through a modern psychiatric lens, describe symptom profiles consistent with dissociative identity disorder, with epilepsy, with schizophrenia, with Tourette syndrome, and with other conditions that have clear neurological or psychological bases. Others describe symptoms and behaviors that do not map cleanly onto any recognized diagnostic category, that involve physical manifestations, changes in apparent physical strength, resistance to pain, and alterations in sensory capacity, that the available psychiatric literature does not straightforwardly account for. The exorcism literature of the medieval church, which is extraordinarily extensive and which describes possession cases from across the medieval centuries with considerable clinical detail, has been a source for medical historians precisely because of the quality of its observation. The medieval exorcist was paying very close attention to the person in front of him. His explanatory framework was entirely different from that of a modern clinician. But his observational record, filtered through that framework, sometimes describes things that the modern framework has not yet provided a fully satisfying account of. The medieval mystic experiences described by figures such as Julian of Norwich, Meister Eckhart, John of the Cross, and dozens of less famous individuals across the medieval centuries share structural features across cultures and religious traditions that have attracted the sustained attention of neurologists, psychologists, and philosophers of mind. The experience of unity with the divine, the dissolution of the boundary between self and world, the sense of timelessness, and of the presence of ultimate reality, described in medieval mystical literature with an eloquence and a precision that makes it among the most powerful writing the period produced, corresponds to states of consciousness that have been documented in modern neuroscientific research, and that appear to involve specific patterns of neural activity that can be induced by meditation, by certain drugs, and occasionally by spontaneous neurological events. The correspondence between what medieval mystics described and what modern neuroscience can measure does not resolve the question of what these experiences mean, or whether they constitute genuine contact with a reality beyond the ordinary. It simply establishes that they are real experiences, not literary inventions, and that the neural basis of mystical experience is a genuine object of scientific inquiry. What medieval mysticism actually was, in its deepest nature, is a question that science has illuminated without answering, which is perhaps exactly what the mystics themselves would have predicted. The medieval period produced numerous accounts of individuals surviving injuries and illnesses that should, by all medical reasoning, have been fatal. The survival literature of the period, largely preserved in the miracle accounts associated with pilgrimage shrines and with the canonization processes of saints, contains hundreds of cases describing recoveries from conditions whose descriptions are specific enough to be medically analyzed. Survivors of falls from great heights, survivors of sword wounds that penetrated the chest cavity, survivors of illnesses described in terms that modern clinicians have identified as consistent with conditions carrying very high mortality rates, even with modern treatment. The medical historian's standard response to these accounts is that they represent misdiagnosis, exaggeration, or the operation of powerful placebo effects in conditions that were less severe than described. This response accounts for many of the cases. It does not account for all of them, and the cases it does not account for tend to be precisely the ones with the most specific and the most credible documentation. The cases where the injury or illness was witnessed by multiple people, recorded by literate observers close in time to the event, and described in terms that leave little room for the charitable interpretation of misdiagnosis or exaggeration. The survival cases in medieval miracle literature represent one of the most challenging bodies of evidence in medieval medical history. Challenging not because they are poorly documented, but because some of them are very well documented and still describe things that medicine finds difficult to explain. The account of the wild hunt, the spectral cavalcade of riders and hounds that was reported across northern and central Europe throughout the medieval period, crossing the sky on stormy nights and presaging death or disaster, exists in so many independent medieval sources from so many different regions that it clearly represents something that large numbers of medieval people experienced or believed they experienced with great vividness and consistency. Modern folklorists have analyzed the wild hunt tradition extensively and have proposed origins ranging from the psychology of grief and the projection of the dead onto the threatening sky to the misinterpretation of natural phenomena such as migrating birds, whose calls in the darkness above a medieval village could produce precisely the auditory experience of a hunt passing overhead. The consistency of the wild hunt reports across cultures that had limited contact with each other, the specific details that recur independently in Norse, German, English, and French accounts, and the emotional intensity that the accounts preserve across the centuries of their transmission all suggest that whatever the wild hunt was, it was not simply a story, it was an experience. What kind of experience, whether psychological, neurological, meteorological, or something else entirely, is a question that the comparative folklore literature has examined with great care and has not yet fully answered. There is a kind of knowledge that does not travel well. It lives in the hands of the person who possesses it. in the muscle memory of a craftsman who learned by watching and doing rather than by reading, in the intuitions of a physician who has seen 1,000 patients and developed an understanding of illness that he could not fully articulate even if asked to try. This kind of knowledge is enormously powerful and enormously fragile simultaneously. It can produce results that formal theoretical knowledge cannot replicate, and it can disappear in a generation in the time it takes for the person who holds it to die without having passed it on completely, leaving behind only the products of that knowledge, the buildings that stand, the cures that worked, the astronomical calculations that proved accurate, as evidence that the knowledge once existed without preserving the knowledge itself. The medieval period was full of this kind of knowing, full of practitioners whose results exceeded what their documented theory should have allowed, full of healers and builders and navigators and astronomers whose achievements sit in the historical record like objects left behind by people who departed without explanation, inviting examination and resisting full understanding in equal measure. Tonight we move into this territory, into the space where medieval knowledge met the boundaries of what modern science can reconstruct, and where those boundaries, examined carefully and honestly, turn out to be less definitive than we might prefer them to be. The medical school at Salerno in southern Italy, active from at least the 10th century and considered the first medical school in the Western medieval world, produced a body of clinical knowledge and practice that modern historians of medicine have found significantly more sophisticated than the standard narrative of medieval medicine, as purely theoretical and largely ineffective would suggest. The Salernitan physicians had access to Arabic and Greek medical texts in translation, and they synthesized this theoretical inheritance with a tradition of practical clinical observation that produced diagnostic and therapeutic approaches whose empirical basis was genuine. The school's most famous female figure, Trotula, whose name is associated with a series of texts on women's medicine that were among the most widely read medical works of the medieval period, described gynecological and obstetric conditions and their treatments with a clinical specificity that modern gynecologists reading the texts have found both impressive and occasionally accurate in ways that the theoretical framework of the period does not fully account for. The question of who Trotula actually was, whether she was a single historical person, a composite figure, or a name attached to a compilation from multiple sources, is one that medieval medical historians have debated extensively. The question of where the clinical knowledge in the texts associated with her name came from, what combination of direct observation, accumulated practical tradition, and translated theoretical sources produced it, is one that the historical record answers only partially, and that the quality of the knowledge itself makes genuinely interesting. The Norse navigators who crossed the North Atlantic in the medieval period, reaching Iceland, Greenland, and the coast of North America, did so without magnetic compasses, without sextants, without any of the navigational instruments that later European maritime expansion depended upon. How they navigated across open ocean, out of sight of land for weeks at a time, with sufficient accuracy to reliably find their destinations across thousands of kilometers of featureless water, is a question that maritime historians and archaeologists have been investigating for decades. The textual sources describe the use of the sun and stars, of ocean swell patterns, of bird behavior, of cloud formations above distant land, of sea color and temperature, all of which are genuine navigational techniques used by traditional maritime cultures in various parts of the world. One specific technology described in some Norse sources is the solarstein, the sunstone, a crystal that could allegedly be used to locate the sun's position even on overcast days. In 2013, archaeologists excavating an Elizabethan shipwreck found an Iceland spar crystal, a form of calcite with strong polarizing optical properties, among the navigational equipment. Laboratory testing has demonstrated that Iceland spar can indeed be used to determine the position of the sun through cloud cover by rotating the crystal until the two images it produces of a light source become equal in brightness, at which point the crystal's orientation indicates the sun's direction. The sunstone was not a myth. It was a technology, one that was developed, used across centuries of North Atlantic navigation, and then forgotten so completely that its rediscovery required both an archaeological find and a laboratory demonstration to establish that it had ever existed. The medieval Islamic physician Ibn Sina, known in the West as Avicenna, produced in his Canon of Medicine a work that served as the primary medical textbook in both Islamic and European universities for approximately 6 centuries, from the 11th century through the 17th. This longevity is itself remarkable. But what is more remarkable, from a modern medical perspective, is the specific content of certain sections of the canon that describe clinical phenomena and therapeutic approaches whose validity was not recognized by Western medicine until centuries after Ibn Sina's death. His description of the contagious nature of certain diseases, his proposal that bodily secretions could contaminate soil and water and spread illness to new hosts, his recommendation of quarantine for tuberculosis, all of these anticipate the germ theory of disease by approximately 800 years. His description of the differential diagnosis of mediastinitis, the inflammation of the chest cavity, has been found by modern clinicians to be accurate and clinically useful. His pharmacological sections describe compounds and preparations whose active ingredients have been identified by modern chemistry and whose therapeutic effects have been confirmed by modern pharmacology in a significant number of cases. Ibn Sina was not simply a synthesizer of earlier knowledge. He was an original clinical observer whose results in certain areas exceeded what his theoretical framework should have allowed, and whose work contains anticipations of modern medical understanding that the history of medicine has not fully explained. The construction of medieval water management systems across Europe and the Islamic world produced engineering achievements whose sophistication is only now being fully appreciated by historians of technology. The Qanat system of underground water channels, developed in ancient Persia and maintained and extended through the medieval Islamic period, moves water from mountain aquifers to agricultural land across distances of many kilometers, through channels that maintain a precise gradient, shallow enough to allow water to flow by gravity without losing it to evaporation, steep enough to maintain the flow rate necessary for agricultural use. The engineering of these systems required the ability to calculate and maintain precise gradients over long distances, to survey subsurface geology, and to coordinate the work of large teams across extended timelines, all without the surveying instruments or the mathematical tools that modern engineering considers necessary for work of this precision. The medieval Qanats that survive in Iran and other parts of the Middle East have been surveyed by modern engineers who have found their gradients to be accurate to within fractions of a degree across distances of 10, 20, and, in some cases, more than 50 kilometers. How the medieval engineers achieved this accuracy, what tools they used, and what methods they applied, is described in some medieval sources, but not with enough specificity to fully account for the precision of the results. The medieval alchemist and natural philosopher Jabir ibn Hayyan, known in the Western tradition as Geber, produced in the 8th and 9th centuries, a body of chemical writing that describes laboratory procedures, chemical reactions, and the properties of substances, with a specificity that places him among the founders of experimental chemistry. The attribution of the medieval Latin alchemical corpus to Jabir is complex and contested, since it is not clear how much of the Latin Geber corpus actually derives from the Arabic writings of Jabir ibn Hayyan, and how much was composed by later authors writing under his name. But what is clear from the Arabic texts that can be securely attributed to the historical Jabir is that he described chemical processes including distillation, crystallization, calcination, and sublimation, with an accuracy that reflects genuine laboratory experience rather than purely theoretical speculation. He described the preparation of substances including nitric acid, sulfuric acid, and aqua regia, the mixture capable of dissolving gold, that were not independently described in European chemistry until centuries later. The question of how this knowledge was transmitted from the Arabic tradition to the European one, what was preserved and what was lost in the transmission, and whether the European rediscovery of these chemical processes was truly independent or reflected a more indirect inheritance from the Islamic tradition, is one that the history of chemistry has examined without arriving at a definitive answer. The phenomenon of individuals in the medieval period who demonstrated what contemporaries described as an ability to predict future events with unusual accuracy sits in an uncomfortable position in the historical record, because the documentation of specific predictions and their fulfillment is extensive enough to be taken seriously and problematic enough to resist simple explanation. The prophecies attributed to Hildegard of Bingen, whom we encountered earlier in the context of her medical knowledge, include predictions of political events whose apparent fulfillment was noted by contemporaries and has been analyzed by modern historians. The prophecies of Merlin, which circulated in an extraordinarily wide range of medieval texts, were applied to political events across several centuries, with a consistency that their medieval interpreters found remarkable, and that modern literary historians attribute to the extreme flexibility of the prophetic language, sufficiently vague to be applied to many different events, sufficiently specific to feel accurate in retrospect. The distinction between genuine prediction and post hoc interpretation is one that the medieval prophetic literature makes very difficult to maintain, because the texts were edited and updated over time in ways that are not always detectable, fitting the prophecies to events that had already occurred while preserving the appearance of prior prediction. But the question of whether all apparent medieval prediction can be accounted for in this way, whether the prophetic tradition contains any residue that the mechanisms of vague language and retrospective interpretation cannot fully absorb, is one that the literature of medieval prophecy poses without clearly answering. The transmission of astronomical knowledge through the medieval period produced achievements whose accuracy continues to surprise modern astronomers examining the primary sources. The Islamic astronomers of the medieval period, working at observatories in Baghdad, Cairo, Samarkand, and elsewhere, produced tables of planetary motion, measurements of the Earth's circumference and axial tilt, and observations of stellar positions whose accuracy has been confirmed by modern calculation, and that in some cases exceeds what the instruments available to medieval observers should theoretically have been capable of producing. The Zij, the astronomical tables compiled by Islamic astronomers across the medieval centuries, were used by navigators and calendar makers for centuries, and were found by the European astronomers who eventually inherited them to be accurate to a degree that required no significant correction for practical purposes. How medieval astronomers achieved this accuracy with instruments that were fundamentally less precise than those available to later European astronomers is a question that the history of astronomy has examined carefully. The answer involves a combination of the use of very large instruments, whose size partially compensated for the limitations of their precision, the averaging of large numbers of observations to reduce random error, and a tradition of careful record-keeping that allowed medieval astronomers to draw on centuries of accumulated data in ways that compensated for the limitations of any single observation. This answer is technically satisfying. It does not fully account for all the cases in which medieval astronomical accuracy exceeded what even these methods should have produced. The medieval period produced individuals who survived conditions that modern medicine considers incompatible with survival without treatment, and whose survival the medical literature of the period describes in terms that mix the accurate observation of remarkable recovery with the theological interpretation of divine intervention in ways that are impossible to fully separate from each other at a distance of centuries. The survival of individuals struck by lightning, which carries a mortality rate in modern populations of approximately 10%, but which in the medieval period, with no access to cardiac resuscitation or treatment for the associated injuries, should have been considerably higher, is described in enough medieval miracle accounts with enough specific clinical detail to suggest that the survival rate among lightning strike victims in the medieval period may have been genuinely remarkable. Whether this reflects something about the nature of medieval lightning strikes, something about the resilience of populations that had not been softened by the cushioning effects of modern medicine, something about the power of belief and the placebo effect in producing genuine physiological changes, or simply the selective preservation of survival accounts in a literature designed to document miracles rather than mortality, is a question that the sources do not clearly answer. The medieval maps known as Mappae Mundi, the world maps produced primarily by European ecclesiastical scholars between the 9th and 15th centuries, are often dismissed as evidence of medieval geographical ignorance. Their schematic representations of the world, organized around theological rather than geographical principles, taken as proof that medieval scholars had no interest in or capacity for accurate geographical knowledge. This dismissal is significantly unfair to the actual content of many Mappae Mundi and reflects a misunderstanding of what these maps were for. They were not navigational documents. They were cosmological ones, designed to represent the world as a theological and philosophical whole rather than as a practical guide to travel. Within that framework, they contain a great deal of genuine geographical information, accurately representing the relative positions of major regions, recording the existence of places whose location was known through trade contact and travel accounts, and preserving geographical knowledge from ancient sources that had been accumulated over centuries. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, produced around 1300 and the largest surviving medieval map, contains over 1,000 place names and geographical features, many of which are accurately located relative to each other in ways that reflect genuine geographical knowledge rather than theological schematism. What the Mappae Mundi actually knew, and how that knowledge was accumulated and organized, is a question that medieval cartography is only beginning to answer with the sophistication it deserves. The medieval herbalists and apothecaries who produced the pharmaceutical tradition of the period worked within a theoretical framework, based primarily on the humoral theory inherited from ancient Greek medicine, that modern pharmacology has largely discarded. and yet the specific preparations that this tradition produced, the compounds and combinations of plant materials that were applied to specific conditions by medieval practitioners across the centuries, have been found by modern pharmacological analysis to contain biologically active compounds whose therapeutic effects are real and, in some cases, significant. Willow bark, used by medieval healers for fever and pain, contains salicin, the precursor to aspirin. Foxglove, used in various medieval preparations for heart conditions, contains digitalis, still used in modern cardiology. Garlic preparations used for infections contain compounds with genuine antimicrobial activity. The list of medieval medicinal plants whose traditional uses have been confirmed by modern pharmacology is extensive, running to hundreds of species across the European and Islamic herbal traditions. This confirmation raises a question that the history of medicine has not fully answered. How did medieval practitioners identify the therapeutic properties of these plants with sufficient reliability to embed them in a consistent tradition of use? The answer most commonly offered is trial and error over many generations, which is certainly part of the truth. But the speed and the accuracy with which some therapeutic identifications appear to have been made, and the consistency with which they were maintained across cultures with limited contact, suggests that there may be more to the story than simple empirical accumulation, though what that more consists of remains genuinely unclear. The medieval period produced a small number of individuals whose intellectual achievements so far exceeded the resources available to them in terms of the texts they had access to, the education they received, and the institutions that supported their work, that historians of science and philosophy have found them genuinely difficult to account for within the normal frameworks of intellectual history. Roger Bacon, whom we encountered in our first section, is one. Nicole Oresme, the 14th century French philosopher and mathematician who anticipated several key concepts of the scientific revolution in his work on the geometry of motion, on the rotation of the Earth, and on the mathematics of infinite series, is another. Oresme's work was known to later scientists, including those of the 16th and 17th centuries, whose achievements are conventionally described as revolutionary departures from medieval thinking, and the question of how much of the scientific revolution was genuinely new and how much was the recovery and extension of insights that medieval scholars had already arrived at, is one that the history of science has been examining with increasing seriousness in recent decades. The medieval origins of early modern science are more substantial and more direct than the conventional narrative of a dark age followed by an enlightenment acknowledges, and the individuals at the center of those origins are more remarkable and more mysterious in their remarkableness than the standard account has had room for. The relationship between medieval music and the mathematical tradition that underpinned it, produced in the polyphonic compositions of the Notre Dame school in 12th and 13th century Paris, a body of music whose structural complexity and whose acoustic effects in the specific acoustic environment of the Gothic cathedral for which it was composed have been analyzed by modern musicologists and acousticians, with findings that continue to generate surprise and debate. The compositions of Léonin and Perrotin, the two figures most associated with the Notre Dame school, were designed to be performed in spaces with reverberation times of 5 to 6 seconds, and the rhythmic and harmonic structures of the music were calibrated to work with that reverberation rather than against it, creating acoustic effects that are not fully audible in modern concert hall performances, and that require the specific acoustic environment of a Gothic cathedral to fully manifest. The sophistication of this calibration, the way the musical structure and the architectural acoustic were designed in relation to each other, implies either a level of theoretical understanding of acoustic physics that the documentary record of 12th century musical theory does not account for, or an empirical tradition of composition and performance in large reverberant spaces that had developed over enough generations to produce this calibration intuitively. Either possibility is remarkable. The music of the Notre Dame School, performed in the building it was written for, produces an experience that modern listeners who have heard it in that context consistently describe as unlike anything else in their musical experience, an experience that the available musicological and acoustic analysis describes in technical terms without capturing in human ones. Every journey through the unknown reaches a point where the territory ahead becomes less charted than anything that has come before. We have moved through medieval mysteries of nature and of human behavior, through the inexplicable achievements of builders and scientists and healers, through the strange events that the chronicles preserved and the centuries have not explained. What remains in this final section are the mysteries that sit at the outermost edges of what the medieval record contains, the events and phenomena that even the most careful and the most skeptical historical examination leaves genuinely open, the questions that have attracted the most sustained attention from the most qualified researchers, and that have responded to that attention by remaining exactly as mysterious as they were before the attention began. These are not mysteries that have been neglected or that await simply the right researcher with the right tools. They are mysteries that have been examined with everything that historical scholarship, modern science, archaeology, linguistics, physics, and medicine can bring to bear, and that have emerged from all of that examination, still asking their questions in the same quiet, patient voice that they have been asking them in for 5 or 6 or 7 centuries. If you are still with me now, if the world outside has gone fully dark, and your breathing has slowed, and the day has receded to the point where it feels like something that happened to someone else a long time ago, then this is exactly the right state in which to receive what comes next. Because these final mysteries do not require analysis. They require something closer to what the medieval mind itself brought to the inexplicable, a willingness to sit with not knowing, a capacity to find the open question more honest and ultimately more interesting than any answer that closes it prematurely. The wow signal, which was detected by the Big Ear radio telescope at Ohio State University in 1977, was a strong narrowband radio signal whose characteristics matched so precisely the profile that theoretical astronomers had predicted an extraterrestrial transmission might have, that the astronomer who noticed it in the data circled it and wrote the word "wow" in the margin. It has never been detected again despite extensive subsequent monitoring. It is not a medieval mystery, but it connects to one in a way that is worth considering carefully. Throughout the medieval period, astronomers and natural philosophers in the Islamic world and in Europe observed the night sky with instruments of limited precision but with extraordinary attentiveness, accumulating records of celestial phenomena across centuries. Among those records are accounts of signals and lights and phenomena that do not correspond to any known astronomical object or event, observed at specific times and from specific locations by observers whose reliability in other respects is well established. The medieval astronomical record is not a collection of naive misinterpretations. It is a body of careful observation filtered through a theoretical framework that was sometimes inadequate to explain what was being seen. How many of the anomalies in that record represent phenomena that modern astronomy has since explained? How many represent genuine observational errors, and how many represent something that has not yet been identified, is a question that the history of astronomy has not fully answered, and that the medieval record, in its patient accumulation of centuries of sky-watching, continues to pose. The Cadborosaurus, the sea serpent whose reported sightings off the coast of British Columbia have continued into the modern period, is one of many large unknown marine animals whose possible existence connects the modern cryptozoological record to the medieval one in ways that marine biologists have found increasingly difficult to dismiss entirely. The medieval seas were genuinely less well known than they are today, their depths uncharted, their ecosystems barely understood, their creatures encountered only by those who sailed them in wooden ships without the means to examine what they saw closely or to preserve specimens for later analysis. The medieval accounts of enormous unknown sea creatures, described with sufficient specificity to suggest genuine encounters rather than pure invention, sit in a relationship with the modern biological record that has been altered by the discovery of the giant squid in sufficient quantities to be studied, the continued occasional sightings of unidentified large marine animals by credible witnesses, and the persistent inability of marine biology to account with confidence for what lives at the deepest and least explored levels of the ocean. The medieval sea monster was not simply a figure of ignorance. It was a figure of incomplete knowledge, a recognition that the ocean contained things that the available categories of understanding could not accommodate. Some of those things have since been identified. Whether all of them have been is a question that the ocean, which covers the majority of the Earth's surface, and whose deepest regions have been explored less thoroughly than the surface of the Moon, has not yet definitively answered. The medieval period produced several instances of what chroniclers described as voices heard in empty spaces, sounds without apparent physical source, music arising from locations where no musicians were present. The acoustic explanation for many of these accounts is available and straightforward. Medieval buildings, particularly the great stone churches and cathedrals, are acoustic environments of unusual complexity that produce sounds through the movement of air, the settling of stone, and the transmission of vibrations from distant sources in ways that can be startling and inexplicable to observers without acoustic knowledge. Wind passing across the opening of a tower can produce tones of considerable volume and apparent musicality. The movement of underground water can transmit sounds through stone to locations far from the water's actual position. These explanations account for the physics of many medieval acoustic mysteries. They do not account for the consistent pattern across many independent medieval accounts of these sounds being heard specifically in contexts of intense religious experience, at specific liturgical moments, in specific locations associated with particular saints or with particular prayers. Whether this pattern reflects the selective preservation of accounts that fit a theological narrative, the heightening of auditory sensitivity that accompanies altered states produced by intense religious practice, or something that the acoustic explanations do not fully cover, is a question that the phenomenology of religious experience and the physics of medieval acoustics have approached from different directions without meeting in the middle. The fate of the Holy Lance, the spear said to have pierced the side of Christ at the crucifixion, is a medieval mystery that intersects the history of religion, the history of political power, and the history of object authentication in ways that illuminate something important about the medieval relationship with physical relics and their capacity to produce real historical effects, regardless of their physical authenticity. Multiple objects claimed to be the Holy Lance circulated in the medieval period. The lance displayed in Antioch during the First Crusade in 1098, whose discovery in a church at a moment of military crisis produced a transformation in the morale and fighting capacity of the Crusader army that contemporaries described as miraculous, and that military historians have analyzed as a genuine tactical turning point, was in all probability not what it was claimed to be. The physical object may have been planted by a monk named Peter Bartholomew, who described receiving visions directing him to its location. But what the object produced, the reversal of a military situation that appeared hopeless, the restoration of fighting capacity in an army on the edge of collapse, was real. The psychological and social mechanisms through which an object of contested authenticity produced genuine military effects of documented historical significance is a question that the history of the Crusades finds genuinely interesting, and that modern social psychology can illuminate without fully explaining. The Holy Lance was, in a meaningful historical sense, what it was believed to be, regardless of what it physically was. That relationship between belief and reality, between the claimed identity of an object and its actual historical power, is one of the most important and most under-examined themes in medieval history. The medieval period produced a body of mathematical knowledge that sits in an uncomfortable relationship with the standard narrative of European intellectual history. The mathematical achievements of Islamic scholars in the medieval period, including the development of algebra by al-Khwarizmi in the 9th century, the work on combinatorics and number theory by scholars in the Islamic West, and the development of sophisticated computational methods for astronomical calculation were transmitted to European scholars through translation movements centered in Toledo and Sicily in the 11th and 12th centuries. What was transmitted is documented in the surviving Latin translations. What was not transmitted, what existed in the Arabic mathematical tradition and did not make it into the Latin corpus for reasons of selection, of translation difficulty, or of simple historical accident, is known only partially through the Arabic manuscripts that survive and that have been systematically studied only in recent decades. The question of whether there were mathematical insights in the medieval Islamic tradition that were known in their original context, lost in transmission, and independently rediscovered by European mathematicians in the early modern period, is one that the history of mathematics is actively examining and has not yet answered with the completeness that the question deserves. The mystery of why the medieval warm period ended and the Little Ice Age began is, in purely climatological terms, a question that modern climate science has significantly illuminated without fully resolving. The cooling that began in the 14th century and that deepened through the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries was produced by a combination of factors including reduced solar activity, increased volcanic activity, and changes in ocean circulation patterns, all of which have been identified and measured in the paleoclimate record with considerable precision. What has not been fully explained is the triggering mechanism, the initial perturbation that set the system moving toward its cooler equilibrium, and the question of whether the human changes to the landscape of the medieval period, the deforestation, the drainage of wetlands, the expansion and then contraction of agricultural land, contributed to the climatic shift in ways that the current models do not fully capture. The Little Ice Age killed people on a scale that rivals the Black Death, though its mortality was distributed across centuries rather than concentrated in a few years, and was therefore less visible as a single catastrophe. Its causes remain incompletely understood. The relationship between the medieval human world and the climate that both shaped it and was shaped by it, is one of the most important questions that the interdisciplinary field of historical climatology is currently working on. The survival of pre-Christian beliefs and practices in the medieval European population is documented in the records of ecclesiastical authorities who were working to suppress those beliefs and practices throughout the medieval centuries, a documentary situation that tells us that the old ways persisted while giving us only the opponent's account of what those ways actually were. The charms and rituals and seasonal observances that survived in the interstices of medieval Christian practice, adapted and disguised and merged with Christian forms in ways that made them both invisible to casual observation and deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life. Preserved fragments of earlier knowledge systems, whose full nature and extent is one of the most fascinating open questions in medieval cultural history. What did medieval peasants actually believe in the privacy of their own minds and the intimacy of their own communities about the forces that governed their world? The answer that the ecclesiastical record gives us is partial, interested, and mediated through the lens of an institution that was simultaneously trying to understand what it was suppressing and to suppress it effectively. The answer that archaeology and folklore and the careful reading of documents against their grain can construct is richer but still incomplete. What medieval people actually thought, below the level of what they were required to say in confession and what the Church required them to believe, is the great unanswered question of medieval cultural history, and it is unlikely ever to be fully answered. The question of what happened to the Neanderthal population in Europe and Western Asia, which disappeared from the fossil record approximately 40,000 years ago, around the time of the arrival of anatomically modern humans, is not a medieval question, but it connects to one in a way that has been discussed in the academic literature with increasing seriousness. Throughout the medieval period, European chronicles and folklore traditions preserve accounts of wild men, of forest-dwelling creatures that were neither fully human nor fully animal, of encounters with beings described in terms that suggest something intermediate between the human and the non-human. Modern paleoanthropology has established that anatomically, modern humans interbred with Neanderthals, and that most people of non-African ancestry carry a small percentage of Neanderthal DNA. The question of whether isolated Neanderthal or other archaic human populations survived into periods much closer to the historical than the mainstream scientific consensus currently allows, and whether the medieval wild man tradition preserves in distorted form a genuine cultural memory of encounters with such populations, is one that mainstream paleoanthropology treats with significant skepticism, and that a small number of researchers have pursued with a persistence that the mainstream has not yet fully engaged with. It is a question that sits at the boundary of what science currently accepts and what the evidence, taken in its full range, might be pointing toward. The final mystery we will consider tonight is not an event or a place or an artifact. It is the medieval mind itself, the consciousness of a person living in the 12th or 13th or 14th century, formed by a worldview in which the natural and the supernatural were not distinct categories, in which every event was simultaneously physical and theological, in which the world was saturated with meaning at every level, and the task of the human intellect was not to explain that meaning away, but to read it accurately. What was it like to inhabit that consciousness? What did the world feel like from the inside of a mind that experienced no fundamental distinction between the rain that fell on the crops and the divine judgment that the rain expressed? We cannot fully answer this question, The documents that medieval people left behind are written in languages we can translate, but the consciousness that produced those documents was organized on principles that we have largely dismantled, and the experience of living inside those principles cannot be reconstructed from the outside, however carefully the outside is examined. The medieval world was not simply a world that knew less than ours. It was a world that knew differently, that organized its knowing around different centers of gravity, that found meaning in places where modern consciousness finds only matter, and that experienced the inexplicable not as a failure of understanding, but as an invitation to a deeper kind of attention. The mysteries we have been exploring tonight were not, for the people who lived them, simply unsolved problems awaiting better tools. They were the normal texture of a world in which the known and the unknown were neighbors, in which the boundary between the explicable and the inexplicable was permeable in both directions, and in which the proper response to something that could not be understood was not frustration, but wonder. That wonder is, perhaps, the most important thing the medieval world has left us. Not the artifacts or the buildings, or even the mysteries themselves, though all of these matter, but the capacity for wonder that the medieval record preserves in every chronicler who wrote down something strange without needing to explain it away, in every pilgrim who described a healing that exceeded medical expectation without apology, in every astronomer who noted an anomaly in the sky and recorded it carefully and honestly, even though it did not fit the theory. The medieval mind, whatever its limitations, did not close itself against the inexplicable. It opened toward it. It paid it the respect of careful attention without demanding that the attention produce a resolution. There is something in that orientation that the modern world, with all its explanatory power and all its genuine achievements in understanding, might usefully consider. Not the willingness to believe without evidence, but the willingness to sit with what the evidence does not yet explain, and to find in that sitting not defeat, but a kind of honest, patient engagement with the actual complexity of the world. The 100 mysteries we have moved through together tonight will not all be solved. Some of them will be. The tools of science and history continue to improve, and events that were genuinely inexplicable a generation ago have found their explanations in the ice cores and the DNA analysis and the statistical methods that the current generation has available. But some of these mysteries are likely to remain open, not because the tools are inadequate, but because the evidence that would resolve them is simply gone, dissolved into the soil, or burned in the fires that consumed so many medieval archives, or lost in the silence that falls over all human events when the last person who witnessed them has died. Those persistent mysteries are not failures of knowledge. They are the honest shape of a past that was fully as complex and as strange as the present, and that deserves to be remembered in its complexity and its strangeness, rather than flattened into the comfortable simplifications that make history feel manageable and safe. And now, having traveled through 1,000 years of the inexplicable together, it is time to let the journey rest, to set down the chronicles and the astronomical tables and the maps and the miracle accounts and the architectural analyses and all of the accumulated wonder of the medieval world's unresolved questions, and to let the quiet come back in around you. If you are still here, thank you. Thank you for the quality of attention you have brought to these questions. Thank you for staying with the complexity rather than requiring it to simplify itself for your comfort. The people whose stories we have been moving through tonight, the monks who recorded strange lights in the sky, the pilgrims who described healings they could not explain, the children who disappeared from a German town on a June afternoon in 1284 and have never been fully accounted for, all of them deserved this kind of attention. All of them were human beings, living in a world that was as vivid and as real and as full of unexplained experience as the world you are lying in right now. And the fact that their world is separated from yours by 5 or 6 or 7 centuries does not make it less real. It makes the attention you have paid to it tonight more valuable, not less. If this journey through the medieval world's deepest mysteries was something that moved you or intrigued you or made you want to know more, please consider subscribing to the channel and leaving a like on this video. It is the simplest and the most direct way to help more people find their way to this quiet corner of the internet where history is taken seriously and the past is given the weight and the dignity it deserves. And if something in tonight's journey sparked a question or a thought or a memory of something you once read or heard about, leave it in the comments. Every one of them is read, and the best conversations this channel has produced have started in exactly that way. For now, let your body settle into wherever it is. Let the medieval world, with its mysteries and its wonders and its inexplicable events and its patient, unresolved questions, recede gently to the distance where it normally lives, that comfortable place at the back of human awareness where the past is always present without demanding anything specific of us. The world outside is still there. The questions are still open. The mysteries are still waiting, as they have been waiting for centuries, with the particular patience of things that are not in a hurry because they have already lasted this long. Sleep well. Good night. Good